I was sitting in a client's office, halfway across the country, when my phone rang. My husband's voice dripped with smugness as he delivered the bombshell. He was divorcing me, had sold our apartment, and was starting a new life with his girlfriend. He laughed, expecting me to crumble. Instead, I calmly replied, "Sounds good." What he didn't know was that I had a surprise waiting for him. And when I got home, his smile vanished faster than he could say, "I made a mistake." It was a typical morning in a city far from home. I was at a client's office, deep into a presentation about projected growth trends, the kind of work that demanded my full focus. The conference room buzzed with polite murmurs and the soft tapping of keyboards as I clicked through my slides. Everything was moving along smoothly until I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. Normally, I would have ignored it. Work always came first during meetings. But for some reason, I felt an uneasy pull, as if the call was important. Apologizing to the group, I excused myself and stepped out into the hallway. Glancing at the screen, I saw my husband's name. We hadn't spoken much in recent days, so I assumed it was something mundane. Maybe a forgotten bill or a question about groceries. With a slight sigh, I answered. "Hey." His voice came through, casual yet tinged with an odd smugness that immediately put me on edge. Before I could say anything, he continued, "Just thought you should know. I'm divorcing you. I've already sold the apartment. Oh, and I'm moving in with my girlfriend. Good luck finding a new place." I stopped in my tracks, stunned. For a moment, the hallway seemed to close in around me, the distant hum of office chatter fading to silence. The sheer audacity of his words felt like a slap. He wasn't just ending our marriage, he was doing it with a cruel, almost gleeful delight, as if he couldn't wait to twist the knife. But instead of breaking down, something inside me clicked into place. I didn't scream, cry, or demand answers. Instead, I forced my voice to stay calm, cool, even. "Sounds good," I replied evenly, as if he had told me something as ordinary as the weather forecast. There was a pause on his end, as if my reaction had caught him off guard. "Glad you're taking it well," he said after a beat, letting out a chuckle. The sound grated against my ears. I hung up without another word, my mind already racing. He thought he had blindsided me, that his betrayal would leave me scrambling. But as I leaned against the wall, taking a steadying breath, I realized something important. I wasn't going to let him see me fall apart. I returned to the conference room, outwardly composed but inwardly seething. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. My thoughts kept drifting back to the phone call, each word replaying in my mind like a broken record. Divorcing me. Sold the apartment. Moving in with his girlfriend. Good luck finding a new place. How long had he been planning this? Selling the apartment, starting a new life. He must have been making arrangements for weeks, if not months. The realization stung, but it also ignited a spark of determination. He had made his move, and now it was my turn. On the flight back home later that day, I began mentally piecing together my next steps. The apartment sale didn't sit right with me. Something about it felt rushed, almost desperate. I decided I would dig into the details as soon as I landed. For now, though, I allowed myself to sit with the quiet anger simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't the kind of rage that consumed you. It was the kind that sharpened your focus, that made you determined to take control of a situation. By the time the plane touched down, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. He thought he had won, that he held all the cards. But he had underestimated me, and that would be his biggest mistake. As I rode the cab home, I stared out at the city lights, feeling a strange sense of clarity. The life I had built with him was over, but that didn't mean my life was. If anything, this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I called the shots. The apartment might have been empty, and the betrayal fresh, but I wasn't broken. Not even close. The rest of the day passed in a haze, the details of my work fading into the background. I somehow managed to finish my presentation, fielding questions and offering polite smiles, but I barely heard the client's feedback. My husband's betrayal overshadowed everything. It wasn't just about the divorce or even the apartment. It was the smugness in his voice, the way he laughed as though I were nothing more than an inconvenience he was finally rid of. I couldn't shake his words, replaying them in my mind like a broken record. "I'm divorcing you. I've already sold the apartment. Good luck finding a new place." The audacity of it burned. Selling the apartment without telling me? That wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. The hours between the meeting and my flight dragged on, each moment filled with quiet reflection and simmering anger. Sitting in the airport terminal, I stared blankly at the departures board, the weight of his actions pressing down on me. How long had he been planning this? Was this new girlfriend of his the reason he'd been distant for months? The signs had been there, the late nights, the unexplained absences, but I had ignored them, chalking it up to work stress or routine relationship struggles. The plane ride home was long and uncomfortable. I couldn't focus on the in-flight movie or the book I had brought with me. Instead, I kept circling back to the same question. How could he do this? Selling the apartment wasn't just a betrayal, it was a calculated move, one designed to leave me vulnerable and scrambling. At 30,000 feet, as the cabin lights dimmed and the hum of the engines filled the air, I found myself staring out at the endless expanse of clouds. The initial shock had begun to wear off, leaving something else in its place. Anger. Not the explosive kind that left you screaming and crying, but the cold, quiet kind that sharpened your focus and made you determined to act. He thought I was disposable. That much was clear from the way he had delivered the news. He thought he could uproot my life with a single phone call and leave me to pick up the pieces while he played house with someone new. But he was wrong. By the time the plane began its descent, my mind was made up. I wasn't going to let him win. He wanted me to feel small and powerless, but I refused to give him that satisfaction. Beneath my anger, a sense of determination began to take root. I didn't know what my next move would be yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let him walk away from this unscathed. When I finally landed, the exhaustion from the day hit me all at once. But even as I trudged through the airport, dragging my suitcase behind me, my resolve didn't waver. Each step toward the taxi stand felt like a step closer to reclaiming control. The ride home was a strange mix of dread and anticipation. I didn't know what I would find when I walked through the door. Would the apartment be empty? Had he taken everything? Or was this just another one of his dramatic gestures meant to throw me off balance? Either way, I was ready. As the cab pulled up in front of the building, I took a deep breath. The life I had known was over. That much was clear. But I wasn't going to let this be the end of my story. This was just the beginning of something new, something better. He thought he had blindsided me, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. The cab ride from the airport to the apartment felt surreal, a mix of anxiety and numbness. By the time the driver pulled up in front of the building, I had braced myself for the worst. I paid the fare, grabbed my suitcase, and stepped out onto the sidewalk, staring up at the place I had once called home. As soon as I opened the door, I knew he hadn't been bluffing. The apartment was empty. The furniture was gone, the walls bare, and every trace of our shared life had been wiped clean. It wasn't just the absence of things that struck me. It was the cold, calculated way he had done it. He hadn't left behind even the smallest sign of sentimentality, just my suitcase and a handful of personal items he clearly didn't consider worth taking. For a moment, I stood in the middle of the empty living room, the silence almost deafening. I let myself feel the weight of it, the betrayal, the cruelty, the audacity of it all. Then, as the shock began to fade, something else took its place. This wasn't just an ending, it was a clean slate. I dropped my suitcase in the corner and sat down on the hardwood floor, pulling out my laptop. The apartment might have been stripped bare, but it was still mine, or at least, that's what I needed to confirm. Months earlier, when my husband had been distracted by his own pursuits, I had quietly purchased the remaining share of the property. It was a decision I made to secure my own future, a safeguard against the unpredictable. And now it seemed that decision had paid off. I began combing through emails, contracts, and bank statements, my fingers moving rapidly over the keyboard. If he had sold the apartment, there would be a record of it, paperwork, legal filings, something. But the more I searched, the more suspicious the situation became. There was no official record of a sale. No transfer of ownership, no legally binding agreement, nothing to indicate that the apartment had changed hands. What I did find, however, was a suspicious transfer to an account in his name. It was a rushed, poorly executed attempt to liquidate assets, likely in anticipation of his move with his girlfriend. My stomach turned as I pieced it together. He hadn't sold the apartment. He had tried to scam me, assuming I wouldn't notice until it was too late. I stared at the screen, a mix of anger and satisfaction coursing through me. He thought he had outsmarted me, that he could walk away with everything and leave me scrambling to pick up the pieces. But he had underestimated me. The apartment wasn't just a piece of property to me. It was a symbol of everything I had worked for. I wasn't about to let him take it away without a fight. As I sifted through the evidence, I felt a growing sense of clarity. This wasn't just about reclaiming the apartment. It was about reclaiming my power, about showing him that I wasn't the passive, naive person he thought I was. I organized everything meticulously, creating a folder of documents that outlined the fraudulent transfer and my legal ownership of the apartment. It wasn't just about confronting him, it was about ensuring that when the moment came, I would have the upper hand. As I sat there, surrounded by the remnants of what used to be my home, I felt a strange sense of resolve. He thought he had won, that he had the upper hand in this game. But what he didn't realize was that I had been playing a different game all along, one where the stakes were much higher and the consequences far more severe. This wasn't just about getting even. It was about proving to myself that I could rise above his pettiness and deceit, that I could take control of my own narrative. I closed my laptop, feeling the weight of my plan settle into place. He had made the first move, but now it was my turn. And I wasn't just going to win, I was going to make sure he understood exactly what it meant to cross me. For the first time since the phone call, I allowed myself a small smile. The apartment was mine. And soon, he would learn that some battles are lost the moment you underestimate your opponent. I decided to keep my cards close to my chest. If he thought I was scrambling to pick up the pieces, I wanted him to believe it for just a little longer. Over the next week, I kept my communication with him brief and neutral, a few texts here and there, nothing too revealing. He texted once to ask if I'd found somewhere to stay yet, a transparent attempt to needle me. I replied with a vague, working on it, and left it at that. It must have satisfied him, because he didn't push further. He assumed he had won, that I was adrift, frantically trying to figure out my next move. He had no idea that I was quietly preparing for a confrontation that would leave him speechless. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. About a week after I discovered his fraudulent attempt to claim the apartment, he texted me saying he needed to stop by and pick up something he had forgotten. I agreed without hesitation, knowing this was my chance to confront him on my terms. When he arrived, I was waiting for him in the kitchen, sitting calmly at the counter with a folder of documents in front of me. I'd deliberately chosen the seat that faced the front door, giving me a clear view of his entrance. He walked in with the same smug confidence I remembered from our last conversation. His casual air made my blood boil, but I kept my expression neutral. He didn't seem to notice anything amiss as he strolled into the living room, glancing around as if assessing his handiwork. "Oh, didn't expect you to still be here," he said, feigning surprise. His tone was light, almost dismissive, as though I were an afterthought in his grand plan. "No worries," I replied, smiling sweetly. "I was just going over some paperwork. You know, the kind that proves I own this apartment." The shift in his expression was subtle at first, a flicker of confusion followed by a tightening of his jaw. He tried to cover it up, but the cracks in his confidence were already beginning to show. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice just a little too casual. I gestured to the folder in front of me, opening it to reveal the stack of documents I'd meticulously organized. "I mean the legal paperwork that shows I purchased the remaining share of this property months ago," I said, my tone light but firm. "You didn't think to check that before you tried to scam me, did you?" He stared at the papers, his smug facade slipping further with each passing second. "That's not possible," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. "Oh, it's very possible," I replied, sliding a particular document across the counter toward him. "This is the transfer of ownership agreement signed by both of us. Remember this?" "Probably not, since you were too busy with other priorities." His face turned a shade paler as he scanned the document, his eyes darting over the signatures and dates. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Didn't know?" I repeated, arching an eyebrow. "You didn't bother to check. You thought you could walk in here, sell this apartment out from under me, and leave me with nothing. And you were wrong." He opened his mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Don't bother," I said sharply. "I've already contacted my lawyer. Every fraudulent transfer, every shady transaction, it's all documented. You don't have a leg to stand on." For the first time, he looked genuinely panicked. "Wait, we can work this out," he said, his tone shifting from defensive to pleading. "It doesn't have to be like this." I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. "Work this out? You mean like how you worked out selling the apartment without telling me? Or like how you blindsided me with a phone call, laughing as you told me you were leaving me for someone else? No, we're not working this out. You made your choices. Now you can deal with the consequences." His shoulders slumped as he realized the gravity of the situation. The confident, self-assured man who had gloated about leaving me was gone, replaced by someone who looked small and defeated. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, desperation creeping into his voice. "Oh, but I do," I replied, my voice steady. Because you need to learn that actions have consequences. You thought you could treat me like I was disposable, like I wouldn't fight back. But here's the thing. You underestimated me. And that's on you. I stood up, gathering the documents into the folder and tucking it under my arm. Now, unless you want me to call security, I suggest you take whatever you came to pick up and leave. He didn't argue. With a defeated nod, he turned and walked toward the door, his movements sluggish and uncertain. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. But then I remembered the way he had laughed during that phone call, the way he had tried to leave me with nothing. As the door clicked shut behind him, I exhaled deeply, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a turning point. I had taken back control, not just of the apartment but of my life. And as I stood in the quiet stillness of my home, I realized that I wasn't just surviving, I was winning. Even after I laid the groundwork for our confrontation, part of me wondered how he would react. Would he try to argue, attempt to shift the blame, or come clean? Deep down, I already knew the answer. My ex had always been the kind of person who would rather talk his way out of a problem than face it head-on. When he returned a few days later under the pretense of retrieving another forgotten item, I let him walk right into the trap I had carefully prepared. He strode into the apartment with a forced air of nonchalance, like he still had the upper hand. "So, I've been thinking," he began, his tone almost jovial. "Maybe we can sort this out, you know? No need to drag lawyers into it." I tilted my head, feigning interest. "Sort this out?" I echoed. "Like how you sorted out selling the apartment without my knowledge." His confident demeanor wavered, but he recovered quickly. "That was a misunderstanding," he said smoothly, spreading his hands as though he were the victim of some cosmic miscommunication. "I thought the paperwork was finalized." "It's a simple mistake." I leaned back in my chair, the folder of evidence resting on the table between us. "A mistake?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You forged my signature on the transfer documents, funneled money into a hidden account, and tried to leave me homeless. That's not a mistake. That's fraud." His face paled as I opened the folder and slid the first document across the table. It was a copy of the ownership agreement, showing my sole legal claim to the apartment. His eyes darted over the paper, and for a moment, he looked genuinely panicked. "I didn't forge anything," he said weakly, though his voice lacked conviction. I reached into the folder again, this time pulling out copies of the suspicious transfer records. "And what about this?" I asked, sliding the bank statements toward him. "You thought I wouldn't notice the transfer to your personal account? Or did you think I'd be too stupid to figure it out?" His confidence was unraveling before my eyes. "Look," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. Things got out of hand. That's all." I stared at him, my expression cold and unyielding. "You thought you could steal from me and walk away," I said, my voice steady but sharp. "You didn't just betray me, you underestimated me. And that was your biggest mistake." He opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it, realizing he had no defense. For the first time, he seemed to understand the gravity of his actions. The man who had once gloated about leaving me in the dust now looked small and uncertain, a shadow of the person he pretended to be. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I didn't think it would end like this." "Of course you didn't," I replied. "You didn't think at all. You acted out of selfishness, assuming I'd let you get away with it. But here's the thing, I'm not the person you use to manipulate. I know my worth, and I'm done letting you take advantage of me." He looked up at me, desperation flickering in his eyes. "Can't we just move on from this? I'll make it right, I promise." "Move on?" I repeated, incredulous. "You tried to destroy my life, and now you want me to just forgive and forget? That's not how this works. Actions have consequences, and you're about to face every single one of them." The finality in my voice left no room for argument. He slumped in his chair, defeated, as I gathered the documents and returned them to the folder. "You should leave," I said, standing and gesturing toward the door. "Unless you'd like to discuss this further, with my lawyer." He didn't argue. With a resigned nod, he stood and shuffled toward the door. For a moment, I thought he might try to salvage his dignity with some parting words, but he said nothing. The sound of the door clicking shut behind him was the only goodbye I needed. As I stood alone in the apartment, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. This wasn't just about exposing his lies or protecting my property. It was about reclaiming my power, proving to myself that I could stand up for what was mine and refuse to be a victim of his deceit. He thought he could break me. Instead, he had given me the push I needed to rebuild my life on my terms. And as I prepared to take the next steps, I knew I was ready for whatever came next. Once the confrontation was behind me, I wasted no time taking the next steps. The apartment wasn't just a place to live. It was proof that I wasn't going to let his lies and betrayal go unchecked. Armed with a mountain of evidence, I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer. When I arrived at the law office, my lawyer, a sharp and no-nonsense professional named Claire, greeted me with a firm handshake. "I've gone over everything you sent," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "You have a solid case. Between the forged signature, the attempted transfer, and the fraudulent activity, he doesn't stand a chance." Her confidence was reassuring, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was truly regaining control. Together, we laid out a plan of action, starting with filing a legal claim against him for fraud and property theft. It wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine, it was about holding him accountable. The paperwork was filed swiftly, and within days, he was served. I imagined the look on his face when he opened the envelope and realized the gravity of the situation. He had underestimated me, and now he was about to learn just how serious I was about protecting what I had worked for. Predictably, he tried to reach out almost immediately. His tone in the messages was drastically different from the smug arrogance he displayed during our last few interactions. Instead of taunts and gloating, he begged for a chance to talk things through. "This doesn't have to go to court," one message read. "We can work something out, just the two of us." When I didn't respond, he showed up at the apartment unannounced, his face pale and his demeanor frantic. "This could ruin me," he said, the desperation in his voice unmistakable. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Should have thought about that before you tried to ruin me," I replied coldly. He launched into a string of excuses, each one more pathetic than the last. "I wasn't thinking clearly," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "It was a mistake. I'll pay you back, I promise. Just drop the charges and we can move on from this." His pleading might have worked on me once, back when I still believed in his ability to change. But now, I saw his words for what they were, empty promises from a man desperate to avoid the consequences of his actions. "This isn't about money," I said, cutting him off mid-sentence. "It's about accountability. You tried to steal from me. You lied, cheated, and left me to fend for myself without a second thought. And now you want me to make this easy for you? Not a chance." He looked like he wanted to argue, but the resolve in my voice stopped him. He must have realized that I wasn't the same person who had once bent over backward to keep the peace. The case moved quickly, thanks to the airtight evidence Claire and I had compiled. The forged signature alone was enough to incriminate him, but the financial records and his blatant attempts to manipulate the situation sealed his fate. Every document, every email, every transfer was a nail in the coffin of his defense. In court, he tried to play the victim, spinning a story about how he had been under pressure, how he had made a momentary lapse in judgment. But the judge wasn't swayed. The evidence was clear, and his excuses fell flat. When the ruling came down in my favor, I felt an overwhelming sense of validation. Not only was the apartment legally confirmed as mine, but he was also ordered to pay damages for the stress and financial hardship his actions had caused. As we left the courtroom, he approached me one last time. "I hope you're happy," he said bitterly, his face a mix of anger and defeat. I looked him square in the eye. "I am," I replied simply. Then, without another word, I turned and walked away. The legal victory wasn't just about the apartment or the money, it was about proving to myself that I had the strength to stand up for what was right. He had tried to break me, but instead, he had only made me stronger. That night, as I sat in the apartment I had fought so hard to keep, I allowed myself a moment of quiet reflection. The battle had been exhausting, but it was worth it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly in control of my own life. The chapter with him was finally closed, and I was ready to move forward, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The fallout from the legal proceedings rippled through every corner of his life, like a carefully constructed tower collapsing in slow motion. Once the court's ruling became official, there was no hiding the truth anymore. His fraud, deceit, and failed attempt to sell the apartment illegally were out in the open for anyone to see. Friends who had once been charmed by his charisma began to distance themselves, their support replaced by whispers of disapproval and quiet judgment. Family members, some of whom had always been skeptical of his inflated ego, openly condemned his actions. Even his new girlfriend, the one he had so proudly left me for, quickly abandoned ship when the reality of his situation became clear. She thought she was trading up, one mutual acquaintance told me during a chance encounter. Turns out, she just inherited his mess. I didn't ask for more details, I didn't need to. The image of his world unraveling was enough. Meanwhile, my own life was heading in a completely different direction. With the legal battle behind me and the apartment officially confirmed as mine, I felt a sense of liberation I hadn't experienced in years. What had once been a shared space burdened with painful memories now became a sanctuary, a place where I could rebuild, redefine, and reclaim my life. Redecorating the apartment was one of the first steps in that process. I got rid of anything that reminded me of him, replacing old furniture and trinkets with items that reflected my own tastes and personality. Bright colors, cozy textures, and meaningful artwork transformed the space into something that felt uniquely mine. Every change, no matter how small, felt like a victory. The new couch I picked out on a whim. The framed photo of a solo trip I'd taken after the divorce. Even the fresh coat of paint on the walls felt symbolic, as though I were erasing the past one brushstroke at a time. I also poured myself into my work with a renewed sense of focus and determination. The same resilience that had carried me through the legal battle now fueled my career. I tackled new projects, took on leadership roles, and even started mentoring younger colleagues. My confidence grew with every success, reminding me that I was capable of thriving on my own. Outside of work, I began reconnecting with friends I had lost touch with during my marriage. It felt like rediscovering a part of myself I had forgotten, the version of me that loved late-night conversations, spontaneous road trips, and laughing until my sides hurt. As I rebuilt my life, occasional updates about my ex filtered through mutual acquaintances. His new relationship had fallen apart shortly after the court ruling. Apparently, his girlfriend hadn't signed up for the reality of his financial struggles and social fallout. Without the facade of success to shield him, his charm wore thin quickly. "He's not doing well," one mutual friend mentioned in passing. "I heard he's living with a friend because he can't afford rent on his own." I nodded politely, offering no reaction. There was a time when hearing about his misfortune would have brought me satisfaction, but by then, I felt nothing but indifference. His life, his choices, and his consequences were no longer my concern. One evening, as I sat on my newly redecorated balcony, sipping a glass of wine and watching the city lights, I reflected on how much had changed. The weight of his betrayal, which had once felt unbearable, now seemed like a distant memory. The life I was building was entirely my own, shaped by my choices, my dreams, and my resilience. He had tried to leave me with nothing, but instead, I had gained everything I needed: freedom, clarity, and a deep sense of self-worth. I didn't dwell on his downfall. There was no need. My life was too full of promise, joy, and possibility to waste energy on the past. And as the cool evening breeze brushed against my skin, I realized I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. The fallout of his actions had consumed his world, but it had freed mine. And for that, I was profoundly grateful. When the dust from the legal battle finally settled, I was left with something I hadn't felt in years: a blank slate. The apartment, once a battleground of betrayal and deceit, was now a symbol of my independence, a tangible reminder of everything I had fought for and reclaimed. Redecorating became a cathartic process, a way to reclaim not just the physical space but also the emotional weight it carried. I started with the walls, painting over the neutral tones he had insisted on with colors that made me feel alive: warm yellows, calming blues, and pops of bold red in unexpected places. Furniture shopping felt like a celebration of my freedom. I chose a plush sofa in a shade of green that made me smile, a coffee table with sleek, modern lines, and a bookshelf that became a shrine to my favorite books and mementos. Every decision was intentional, every piece selected not just for its practicality, but for how it made me feel. As the apartment transformed, so did I. The act of creating a space that reflected my personality reminded me of who I was outside of my marriage, someone with her own tastes, quirks, and dreams. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was a sanctuary, a place where I felt safe, empowered, and wholly myself. But my transformation didn't stop at the apartment. With the legal battle behind me, I began focusing on opportunities one had once pushed aside. At work, I took on new challenges, stepping into leadership roles that pushed me out of my comfort zone. I spearheaded projects that required bold thinking and decisive action, the kind of work that made me excited to get up in the morning. My efforts didn't go unnoticed. My manager praised my creativity and resilience, and I found myself being considered for a promotion, a role that would allow me to mentor others and shape the future of our department. Outside of work, I began saying yes to experiences I had previously avoided. I booked a solo trip to Italy, something I'd dreamed about for years but had always put off. Wandering through the streets of Rome, sipping espresso at outdoor cafes, and marveling at the art and history around me, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't known I was capable of. Back home, I joined a local community group that focused on art and creativity. Meeting people who shared my interests and values was like finding a tribe I didn't know I needed. Our gatherings were filled with laughter, storytelling, and a shared sense of purpose, and I found myself looking forward to each event. Every step forward felt like shedding the weight of my past, replacing it with something brighter and more fulfilling. I no longer felt the need to look over my shoulder or wonder how my ex was faring. His life, his choices, and his struggles were no longer my burden to bear. One evening, after a particularly rewarding day at work, I came home to the apartment, lit a candle, and curled up on my green sofa with a book. The quiet contentment I felt in that moment was something I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about moving on, it was about moving forward. I wasn't simply reclaiming what I had lost. I was discovering new parts of myself I hadn't known existed. The fresh start wasn't without its challenges, but every stumble felt like a step toward growth. I had learned to embrace the uncertainty, to see each new opportunity as a chance to write the next chapter of my life. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see where the journey would take me. The woman I was becoming didn't need validation from anyone else. She was strong, confident, and unafraid to claim the happiness she deserved. And as I looked around my beautifully redecorated apartment, I realized that the life I was building wasn't just a fresh start. It was a testament to my resilience and my ability to thrive. Looking back, it was almost surreal to think about how far I had come. The woman I saw in the mirror now was almost unrecognizable compared to the person I had been just a few years earlier. Back then, I had been quiet, accommodating, and far too willing to sacrifice my own happiness to keep the peace. Now, I was someone who stood tall, who spoke her mind, and who refused to accept anything less than what I deserved. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been countless moments of doubt and nights when the weight of starting over felt almost unbearable. But each challenge had shaped me, teaching me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. I had discovered the importance of self-respect, the power of resilience, and the incredible value of surrounding myself with people who truly cared. One of the most transformative parts of my journey was learning to value my own voice. For so long, I had stayed silent, afraid of confrontation or rejection. But standing up for myself during the legal battle, confronting my ex-husband, and reclaiming my life taught me that my voice mattered. It wasn't just about being heard. It was about believing in myself enough to demand the respect I deserved. With each passing day, I found new reasons to feel grateful. I was grateful for the friends who had supported me through my darkest moments, for the opportunities that had come my way, and for the inner strength I had discovered. Most of all, I was grateful for the chance to start over, to rebuild my life on my terms. The people in my life now reflected the person I had become. My friends were genuine, supportive, and kind. They celebrated my successes and stood by me during tough times, offering encouragement without judgment. These relationships weren't built on obligation or convenience. They were built on mutual respect and trust. Professionally, I had grown in ways I hadn't imagined possible. The promotion I had worked so hard for came through, and with it, a chance to mentor others. Helping my team grow and succeed felt deeply rewarding, and I took pride in knowing that I was creating an environment where others could thrive. As for my ex-husband, I rarely thought about him anymore. When his name did come up in passing, it was usually accompanied by a story of how he had burned another bridge or made yet another poor decision. His downfall was a reminder that actions have consequences, but dwelling on his failures wasn't something I had the energy for. He had once loomed large in my life, casting a shadow over everything I did. But now, he was little more than a footnote in my story. I had moved on, and my life was too full of promise to waste even a moment looking back. One afternoon, as I sat in my favorite cafe, sipping coffee and watching the world go by, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. There had been times when I thought I wouldn't make it, when the pain felt too heavy and the future too uncertain. But here I was, stronger, happier, and more fulfilled than I had ever been. I pulled out my journal and began writing, not out of sadness or regret, but out of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons I had learned, the strength I had found, and the life I was now living. The woman I had become was someone I could be proud of. She wasn't perfect, but she was resilient, determined, and unafraid to chase her dreams. She had faced heartbreak and betrayal, but she had emerged stronger, refusing to let the actions of others define her. As I closed my journal and took another sip of coffee, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty felt exciting instead of terrifying. My journey was far from over, but I knew one thing for certain: I had already won. Not because I had defeated my ex-husband or reclaimed the apartment, but because I had reclaimed myself. And that was the greatest victory of all. Standing in the home I had fought so hard to keep, I felt a wave of pride wash over me. This wasn't just an apartment anymore. It was a testament to everything I had endured and everything I had built. Each piece of furniture, every decoration, every corner of the space felt like a reflection of who I was now, a woman who had reclaimed her life and wasn't afraid to move forward. I took a deep breath, letting the calmness of the moment settle in. For so long, my journey had been about survival, about getting through the next challenge, proving to myself and others that I could withstand the storm. But now, the storm had passed, and I found myself standing in a place of peace, ready to focus not on what I had overcome, but on what I wanted to create. Rediscovering myself hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every struggle. I had learned to trust my instincts, the quiet voice inside me that had always known what I needed, but had often been drowned out by doubt and fear. Following that voice had led me to make decisions that scared me, leaving behind the comfort of my old life, standing up to my ex-husband, and starting over. But those decisions had also brought me here, to a life where I was finally in control. Embracing my independence had been another lesson. I'd spent years compromising, bending to accommodate someone else's needs and desires, losing pieces of myself in the process. But now, I made decisions with confidence, knowing that I was enough on my own. I no longer felt the need to seek validation from anyone else. That independence opened doors I never thought possible. I began pursuing goals that had once seemed out of reach, both personally and professionally. I took up hobbies I had long abandoned, like painting and photography, finding joy in the creative freedom they offered. I planned trips to places I had always dreamed of visiting, knowing that I didn't need permission or approval to explore the world. One of the most surprising parts of my new beginning was how much stronger my relationships became. Freed from the weight of my past, I was able to connect with others in a more authentic way. My friends and family saw the change in me, and our conversations felt deeper, more meaningful. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore, I was fully present in every moment. Professionally, I reached heights I had once thought impossible. The promotion I had earned gave me the platform to mentor others, sharing the lessons I had learned and helping them find their own paths. Watching my team grow and succeed filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't known I was searching for. And yet, my proudest accomplishment wasn't the promotion or the apartment or the trips I had taken. It was the simple realization that I had chosen myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't living for anyone else's expectations or approval. Every decision I made was for me, for my happiness, my growth, and my peace of mind. The future was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare me. Instead, it excited me. There were no limits to what I could achieve or experience, no barriers I couldn't overcome. The life ahead of me was mine to shape, and I was ready to embrace it fully. Every now and then, I'd catch myself thinking about the person I used to be, the woman who had stayed silent, who had let fear and doubt hold her back. I didn't resent her because she had done the best she could with the tools she had at the time. But I was grateful to have moved beyond her, to have grown into someone stronger and more self-assured. As I stood by the window that overlooked the city, the evening lights twinkling in the distance, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. It hadn't been easy, and there were times when I had wanted to give up. But every challenge, every heartbreak, and every triumph had led me to this moment. In the end, I had chosen myself. And as I turned off the lights and settled into the home I had made my own, I realized I wouldn't have it any other way.